Welcome to my pop-up mini-series in which I'll be drawing and painting two very different architectural icons. Now then, how are you doing? I hope you're well. In the 3 previous episodes, I've sketched and painted the Sydney Opera House and drawn the Colosseum in pencil. Well, today in the final episode of this series, my season finale, I'm going to paint up the Colosseum in watercolour. My objective is to try and capture an impression of this great architectural icon. Not necessarily be aiming for quite the same level of detail as in the pencil sketch. The perspective is still going to be a challenge though, as are those many arches. How hard can it be? Before putting any paint to paper, I need to lightly draw my scene out in pencil. As with my previous sketch, this means identifying and establishing the basic underlying shapes within the composition. The Colosseum is oval in shape, which means the outer walls are curved. The overall shape then is roughly cylindrical, and this is my starting point. I've split the height of the building into 4 sections with 3 curved lines. This is followed by a grid designed to help me work out where the arches are going to go. Bear in mind that the individual boxes of that grid need to get smaller as they recede away from us, as will the arches. Although my objective is to try and keep things quite loose, or certainly looser than my earlier pencil sketch, there does still need to be some degree of accuracy and a good, strong foundation upon which to build. Once I'm happy with my drawing, it's time to start throwing some paint at it. Well, let's begin with some raw sienna. I'm applying paint to dry paper, so I need to work quickly if this is to work. Well, this will be followed by my second colour, which is burnt umber, and a third, which will be French ultramarine. I want the 3 colours to bleed and blend together smoothly on the paper, so it's important not to let each colour dry before applying the next, otherwise this would result in hard lines or worse. You might be wondering why I didn't just wet the paper first, which would give me a little more time before it dried. The reason I didn't do that is because the wash needs to be restricted to the area of wall and preferably avoid the spaces where the arches are going to be. To wet it with any degree of accuracy would take time, and there's a good chance it would dry off before I'd applied all my 3 colours anyway, so I didn't consider this to be a viable option. Of course, it would be possible to apply masking fluid to all the arches first, which would give me a bit more freedom, yet still maintain good continuity. I'm not a massive fan of masking fluid, however. I'm far too impatient and prefer to do things the harder, organic way. For the trees, I'm mixing up my go-to basic fresh green from cadmium yellow and Prussian blue. Well, this can be toned down and given a more olive green-like appearance by adding a little burnt umber to it. I want there to be a nice, clear, cloudless blue sky, so my colour of choice for that is Prussian blue. I know, Prussian blue isn't a popular colour, but what can I say? I like it. Somebody has to love it. Again, I'm applying this to dry paper, which means I have to work quickly to prevent it from drying out too prematurely. I'm also having to take some care with painting around the building and the trees. Ideally, I want the blue to go right up to the outer edge of the Colosseum, as close as possible without overlapping. Having applied colour to all the key areas of the scene and achieved a reasonably interesting underwash, I'm now going to apply a few architectural details to the walls of the building. And this is where things are going to differ quite considerably from the earlier pencil sketch. When I was drawing it out in pencil, I was quite keen on getting things as accurate as possible, possibly more so than I had actually intended, in fact. The watercolour is a different kettle of fish entirely. I'm adding details for sure, but this time I'm going to try and be far more selective. Well, there's an overused expression that is still true today as it's always been, and that is less is more. I want to give texture and visual interest to the ancient walls, but I want to do it more by suggestion than anything else. The colour I'm using for this is mostly burnt umber with just a small amount of French ultramarine to neutralise it slightly. What you'll notice is that I'm applying the details quite loosely. More often than not, they consist of nothing more than a squiggle or two, or a broken wobbly line. And in places, I'm softening them off with a damp brush to blend them into the surrounding wash. This helps to keep them suitably ambiguous and open to interpretation. Now, this is as good a time as any to pay a little bit of attention to the figures milling around the base of the Colosseum. The landmark attracts around 7.5 million visitors each year, so it's always pretty busy. It certainly was when we visited. As far as painting them is concerned, I want to keep them as simple as possible. It's a good idea to start with carrot shapes, a small blob for the head just above where the shoulders would be. To prevent your figures looking too static, it's a good idea not to add both arms and legs to every single one. If a figure is walking by, then you might only see one arm or even perhaps only one leg, for instance. Don't make the heads too big, and think twice before adding feet. Mostly they aren't necessary and can just look a little bit odd. Well, most importantly, figures give us the opportunity to throw some bright colours into a scene. These are tourists who like to express themselves. There isn't a great deal of social distancing going on here. One last thing worth mentioning. People come in different shapes and sizes, and it's the different stances that help to give them character. Arm waving and inclined heads can help to link two figures together and provide a touch of narrative. As a general rule, I would suggest it's a good idea to keep their heads all at more or less the same height. As figures recede away from us, they would appear to get smaller, but they should diminish from the feet upwards, not from the head downwards, providing they're all on roughly the same level. And finally, it's time to apply the darkest tones. These are mixed from French ultramarine and burnt umber. Again, I'm applying them sparingly, softening them off here and there to graduate them and blend them in, underneath the tops of the arches, for example. As with the earlier details, I'm happy to let a few squiggles and dots do the job of suggesting architectural ornamentation without getting too fixated on the really awkward fiddly bits. It's surprising how many gaps in information the brain is able to fill in when it's presented with only half the story. The only thing you have to watch out for is that the information you do provide for the viewer is sufficient for them to understand what it is that they're looking at, and the message you're sending out is the one you want to convey. Well, it might be a little rough at the edges, but hopefully it's unmistakable as the Colosseum. There are just a few little finishing touches needed here and there, such as adding a darker tone to the trees and filling in that highlight along their right hand edge, and the painting is more or less complete. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. It could have used a little more finesse, but I'm hoping at least that I managed to capture the essence of the location. I might even be overcoming my aversion to buildings with many arches and windows. But I hope you've enjoyed this short mini-series. It was a spur-of-the-moment thing that had its own technical challenges as well as those posed by the two subjects in question. As well as contrasting styles of construction, each building has a distinctive character of its own. Well, I have to say, I really enjoyed exploring those contrasts. Until next time. stay safe and take care.